Day. Today is Thursday, 19th September, and of course, over the last 2.5 years, more than 2.5 years now actually, the most important topic, the main topic of these programs has been the conflict in Ukraine, but there have been various moments, various times when I have had to focus instead, or have chosen to focus instead, on the situation in the Middle East. And I'm going to cover the situation in the Middle East, the first part of this program, before I do return to the topic of the situation in Ukraine, because the situation in the Middle East has been taking a dramatic turn. But I should say it is a dramatic turn which is not surprising or unanticipated to me. It's been clear to me ever since the events of last October, when Hamas attacked Israel and when Israel subsequently took the decision to begin a military campaign in Gaza against Hamas, a military campaign, by the way, which still continues. It's been clear to me ever since then that the situation in the Middle East is becoming increasingly unstable, and that there is a very high risk that it could spiral out of control. And it has also been my clear view over the last few weeks, since August to be precise, that Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel has been seeking, in some way or form, to enlarge the war, to expand the war, to include Hezbollah and ultimately Iran, and that the various actions of the Israeli government, which he leads, by the way, I should make it clear that it is his government that I'm speaking about, not wider Israeli society, which has many complex and different views on this topic. But anyway, it has been clear to me that it has been the objective of Prime Minister Netanyahu and of his government to expand the war and to expand it into a general conflict involving Israel, Hezbollah, Iran, and, if he can achieve it, the Western powers also on the side of Israel. So, we have had, in succession, a military strike by Israel against an embassy building, an Iranian embassy building in Damascus. That provoked an Iranian counter-response, a missile strike against Israel, which the Iranians discussed in advance with the Americans, and which they sought to calibrate to the extent that they could to avoid an uncontrolled escalation. We then had a further Israeli missile strike on Iran as well, but apparently under intense American pressure, both Israel and Iran downplayed the significance of that particular Israeli missile strike. Then a couple of weeks later, we had the astonishing action, which was the assassination in Tehran of the political head of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, on the very day of the inauguration of the new Iranian president, Mr. Pezeshkian, and just a few hours after Mr. Pezeshkian and Mr. Haniyeh were seen embracing each other, and with expressions from Mr. Pezeshkian of his support for the Palestinians and of his friendship specifically for Haniyeh himself. And there was furious reaction, as I recall, in Iran, lots of talk from the Iranians, which continued right up until the last couple of days, about a major Iranian strike, or at least action, to punish Israel. And like many people, I assumed that this would come. But the weeks and the months have passed. There have been all kinds of American and Western warnings to the Iranians that the United States and the Western powers would stand beside Israel in the event of an attack by Iran against Israel. In programs, I pointed out that these warnings seem to me to be addressed to the wrong party, because it was clear to me that it was not Iran that was intent on escalating the situation in the Middle East and which seemed to be seeking a war. But on the contrary, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government in Israel instead. Anyway, there were all those warnings. 2 US Navy carrier groups were deployed to the Gulf of Oman in preparation for what looked like some kind of strike against Iran. And instead of launching a strike, the Iranian authorities appear to have been in close contact with the Russians. There were visits to Iran by Russia's Security Council Secretary, the former Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. By the way, he has been in Tehran over the last few hours, where he's had high-level meetings with the Iranians, including with President Pezeshkian. So all of these contacts between the Iranians and the Russians, and lots of rumors that the Iranians were receiving from the Russians advanced air defense missiles and other weapon systems and electronic warfare systems, and that the Iranians in return were supplying the Russians with 200 short-range ballistic missiles for use in the conflict in Ukraine. So a generally tense atmosphere, everybody waiting to see what the Iranians would do, waiting to see when the Iranians would do it. The United States, over the last few days, appears to have concluded that it could not keep 2 US Navy carrier groups floating around the Gulf of Oman indefinitely, that the effect was to leave the Pacific exposed to, well, I'm not quite sure to what exactly, but of course the United States perceives itself increasingly as being in some kind of confrontation with China. So about a week ago, we learnt that one of these Navy carriers was leaving the Gulf of Oman and was steaming towards the Pacific to take station there. Anyway, all of this. And of course, I haven't mentioned that at the same time that Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated, the Israelis also assassinated, and I'm sure that it was the Israelis. I ought to say that the Israelis have, of course, never confirmed officially their involvement in any of these assassinations, but I don't think anybody seriously doubts that it was they who were involved. Anyway, alongside Ismail Haniyeh, in Beirut, the Israelis arranged the assassination, or rather the killing, of the Lebanese Hezbollah commander Fouad Shukr, whose exact role in the Hezbollah hierarchy has never been made clear to me, but who is said to have had some kind of close contact with the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. Anyway, so tensions also with Hezbollah, and then a short time ago, about 3 weeks ago, there was reports that that Hezbollah had launched its own missile strike against Israel, and this all seemed to be connected in some way to an Israeli rocket attack, or rather an Iranian rocket, a Hezbollah rocket attack on a target in the Golan Heights, which killed a number of civilians, apparently involved in a football match. They turned out to be Druze civilians who apparently do not accept Israeli sovereignty and are strongly aligned to Syria, the historic owner of this part of the Golan Heights, and according to international law, by the way, the existing owner of this territory on the Golan Heights. But never mind. Anyway, that particular attack was then succeeded almost immediately by reports of a massive Israeli bombing attack on Hezbollah involving 100 aircraft. Then there was a missile strike by Hezbollah against Israel, supposedly directed at an Israeli intelligence center located close to Tel Aviv. There were lots of claims that the missile strike was completely ineffectual, that all it did was hit a chicken farm. There's been some doubts subsequently expressed about whether that was true. It was suggested that the Israelis were downplaying the effectiveness of this Hezbollah missile strike and that some of the missiles did get through and did reach this Israeli headquarters, intelligence headquarters. Of course, there's never been any open source confirmation of that. But anyway, one thing that did happen is that an Israeli warship seems to have been hit by some kind of missile or the debris from a missile, and one Israeli sailor was filmed being killed. I haven't actually watched the film myself, but I understand that that is undisputed. So we can see a whole series of actions and counter-reactions taking place across the Middle East, a kind of shadow boxing taking place between Israel and the Shia alliance, Iran, Hezbollah, and the other Shia militias, by the way, in Iraq. The Israelis taking increasingly forceful steps against the Iranians and the Shia parties. And to some extent at least, and I think this has to be said, the Iranians and the Shia militias pulling their punches. Now, this has been apparently very controversial on the Iranian side. There's been reports, which again obviously cannot be confirmed. No information that comes from secondary and tertiary sources from the Middle East can ever be confirmed, in my opinion. We are in a world where there is rumour, always within rumour, but there was a plausible rumour that there was an angry meeting between officials of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and representatives of the various Shia militias in the Middle East, including the Houthis, who, by the way, I forgot to mention, recently carried out missile strikes on central Israel involving what have been described as hypersonic missiles. From what I can tell, these are simple ballistic missiles, but I stand to be corrected on that. Anyway, the Houthis were present at this meeting. Hezbollah was present at this meeting. Some of the Shia militias from Iraq and elsewhere in Syria were also present. And apparently the meeting was extremely tense and very angry. Fists were banged on the table. People threatened to walk out. Some of the leaders of the Shia militias were absolutely furious that the Iranians had not so far carried out the big strikes against Israel that they appeared to have promised. There was talk apparently of betrayal and cowardice. Some of the people were preparing to leave the room, and the Iranian representatives countered that acting in the way that the militia commanders were demanding would simply play into Prime Minister Netanyahu's hands. Anyway, it was apparently an incredibly tense meeting, but my sense is that Iranian authority just held, and that the Iranians were able to keep the various militias in line. That, of course, all depends on this meeting having actually taken place and the accounts of it being true. As I said, we can never be sure about any of these things. In the meantime, of course, the fighting in Gaza goes on. Hostages have died there. Fighting continues. Hamas, of course, is still there. And Israel's nemesis, Sinwar, the military leader of Hamas, the person who is supposed to have masterminded Hamas's attack on Israel on the 7th of October, has now taken Haniyeh's place as the political chief of Hamas. So that has been the set of events which have led us to this point. And in the meantime, Prime Minister Netanyahu visited the United States. He addressed Congress. He spoke in terms which made it completely clear to me that he wants to see a general war in the Middle East, that he wants a war against Iran. And it seems to me that all of his actions, all of the actions that have been taken by the Israelis, both before and subsequent to that visit, point in the same direction. And that now leads us directly to the events that have taken place over the last 24 hours, because as of course the vast majority of you know, but I suspect that there isn't a single person watching this program who isn't aware of the fact, over the last 24 hours there has been a mass attack on, well, mostly Hezbollah officials or fighters or members, but also involving many civilians as well. Around 20 people apparently have been killed, several more, dozens more have been injured, and it was all carried out initially by exploding pages, and then apparently this all followed up with explosive walkie-talkies. Extraordinary attack carried out by someone against Hezbollah, someone that everybody assumes, I'm sure correctly, is Israel, and I'm going to act again on the assumption that it was, of course, the Israelis. And subsequent to the information about this attack, which, as I said, has killed at least a dozen people, some say a score, about 20 people, and injured many, many, many others, and which many say has humiliated Hezbollah. There are also now reports circulating in the Israeli media and comments made by Israeli officials that a 73-year-old Israeli man has been arrested and is apparently going to be charged with attempting to assassinate Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he supposedly has plotted this assassination with the Iranian intelligence agencies. And there's a complex story circulating about how this man was smuggled into Iran at the back of a truck and met with Iranian intelligence officers, and was paid apparently $5,000 to go to Iran. And anyway, it was all part of some plot by the Iranians to assassinate Netanyahu. And by the way, certain comments that have been made both by Iranian and Hezbollah officials have opened the possibility of assassination attempts against Israeli leaders. I pointed this out myself, as I recall, in one of the programs I made on this channel some time ago. So anyway, lots going on, and there are now reports that Prime Minister Netanyahu has made further statements pointing to an all-out war being imminent between Israel and Hezbollah, that the various Israeli military units that were drawn up on the Lebanese border, which consisted mostly of conscripts, have been withdrawn, that a tough veteran brigade of the Israeli army is being redeployed to the area with the intention of carrying out a cross-border offensive against Hezbollah. And there are also reports that Prime Minister Netanyahu is considering dismissing Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, on the grounds that Mr. Gallant is apparently skeptical to the point of being straightforwardly opposed to Prime Minister Netanyahu's intentions to expand the wall. So, there we go. We can see a steady pattern of escalating violence, of shadow boxing, of Israeli attacks on Iranian and Hezbollah targets, beginning back in April with the attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, and now extending to the use of explosive devices, walkie-talkies apparently now, as well as pagers, against Hezbollah. And, well, there are many questions being asked as to what this was all intended to do, because a number of people are making the entirely valid and correct point that this attack, these attacks using the pages and the walkie-talkies seems to have been conducted prematurely. The logical time to explode these devices through signals that presumably Israeli intelligence would send to these devices, the correct time to do that would have been once the fighting had begun. The Hezbollah fighters using these devices would then have seen their entire communication system break down. There would have been chaos and confusion amongst Hezbollah's ranks, even as the fighting was ongoing, and the Israelis conducting their military offensive would have been able to capitalize on this. But instead, this attack took place in isolation, without a military offensive, giving Hezbollah time to dispose of all of these devices, those that haven't exploded, and any other devices that they might consider suspicious, to develop alternative communications networks, to sort themselves out. Hezbollah is probably the kind of organization that can do that very quickly. So why do it in this sort of way? Well, two possibilities have been floated. One, which is the one that has been coming out of Israel, is that the Israelis did it because they were tipped off that Hezbollah had detected the fact that the pages had been tampered with and was preparing to take steps to dispose of the pages. And the Israelis, rather than see this big investment they made in supplying Hezbollah with these explosive pages, rather than see that go to waste, they decided to explode the devices immediately. Now, that is not an implausible theory. There's been questions asked about how the Israelis would know that Hezbollah had found out that there was this problem with the pages. I don't myself have any difficulty understanding this. I'm assuming that the Israelis monitor Hezbollah communications very closely. The fact that this message had to be sent by Hezbollah to its personnel urgently might have meant that it wasn't properly encrypted, and it's entirely plausible to me that the Israelis saw this and took the step, decided to explode the pages right away whilst there was still time to inflict damage with them. So that's one possibility, but there is another one, and it's the one I personally lean to, which is that just as those Shia militias that met with the representatives of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps at that meeting, that heated meeting, which is supposed to have happened and which I discussed previously, just as those militia people were deeply angry and frustrated by the fact that the Iranians have not acted on their threats so far and not launched strikes against Israel in response to the murder of Ismail Haniyeh. So Prime Minister Netanyahu and his officials, who have been trying to provoke the Iranians to launch an attack of this kind ever since April, an attack which they can then say proves that Iran has some aggressive objective against Israel, such as would justify Israeli counterstrikes against Iran itself, that the Israelis, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his top officials have also become increasingly frustrated and impatient and exasperated that these Iranians, for the moment, have not risen to their bait. And so they too have been looking around for another step that will act as a major provocation, and that's why they exploded these devices at this time. And of course, the fact that the devices are held by Hezbollah, in a sense, works to the Israeli objective, because the Israelis probably know about this meeting that I talked about, the meeting between the Iranians and the Shia militias, and the angry words that passed over the course of this meeting. And so, by targeting specifically Hezbollah again and doing so in this way, they would increase the tensions between Hezbollah and Iran, which must be one of their objectives, and at the same time goad Hezbollah into action, disregarding any Iranian cause for restraint, action which would provoke an Israeli counter response, which this time the Iranians would feel obliged themselves to respond to. So it makes sense, and to be frank, given all that has happened, which I've set out in the first part of this program, it makes sense to me that this is what this latest operation with the pages and the walkie-talkies, and there's some people saying other explosive devices, that this is what this is all about. Now, I have been asked this question, and I've been asked this question by several people, but it was also brought up to me in a program that we've done on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, by Alex Christoforou itself. Why is it so important for the Israelis, for Prime Minister Netanyahu, to provoke the Iranians into an attack on Israel, when presumably Israel is simply in a position to undertake an attack on Iran by itself? Well, I think that there is actually a very simple explanation. On the one hand, it's probably the case that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to unify Israeli society behind such a war. I've seen an opinion poll coming out of Israel which says that 45% of Israelis actually would like to see an all-out war in the Middle East. They feel that the war in Gaza is continuing, that Israel continues to face various threats, and they therefore want to see a further escalation in order to resolve Israel's problems, security problems, once and for all. The very sentiment that I suspect Prime Minister Netanyahu himself has. But 45% is not a majority. It is a very substantial proportion of the Israeli public, almost certainly a plurality. But Prime Minister Netanyahu may feel that if he's going to draw Israel into a long war with Iran, he needs the support not just of what is essentially his own electoral base, but a wider Israeli society as well. That's the first reason. But the other and far more important reason is that if he wants a war with Iran, he also wants the Western powers alongside him. As I pointed out in several places, just a couple of weeks ago, the Israeli Foreign Minister, Mr. Katz, had a meeting with the foreign ministers of various European powers. I remember that the foreign ministers of France and Britain, and I believe of Germany, were participating in this meeting. Certainly the British and French foreign ministers were there. And Mr. Katz went away from the meeting and was telling everybody that the British and the French were signed up to a joint military operation against Iran if Iran did indeed conduct an attack against Israel. This was actual strikes against Iran. Well, a few hours later, the Israeli Foreign Ministry published a readout which walked all that back. But there is no doubt at all that that was what Mr. Katz was saying. And as I said at the time, he was clearly flying a kite and signalling what he and Prime Minister Netanyahu's government overall want, which is they want a conflict with Iran and with Hezbollah, and they want the Western powers, the United States and the major European powers there alongside with them. And presumably they want that because they have some sense of Iran's military power, and they probably understand that a war between Israel and Iran would be a very difficult proposition for Israel if Israel had to conduct it alone. So that's, I think, the game plan, and that is where we are. Now, what is going to happen next? The answer is, I don't know, but I think that the chances of an all-out war, starting with a war between Israel and Hezbollah, that war, the prospects of that war have never been greater. And of course, this story of the assassination attempt, and by the way, I'm not discounting the possibility that it might be true, but the story of this assassination attempt by the Iranians against Prime Minister Netanyahu, of course, plays very well into this whole picture that the Israeli government is trying to convey of an Israel that is facing this existential danger at this time from Hezbollah and Iran. And of course, all of this has been combined with the reports about the delivery by Iran of the 200 ballistic missiles to Russia, a claim, by the way, which Iran has now officially denied, and also the reports that were circulating, some reports that have been circulating over the last couple of days, that the British and the Americans have been talking to each other about the possibility that in return for Iranian military supplies, the Russians will provide the Iranians with nuclear weapons technology so that Iran can convert its stockpile of enriched uranium into a nuclear device. I've made it very clear that I don't believe that that is the case. I don't think that the Russians would provide that information, that kind of technology to the Iranians. I don't see why the Iranians would have to go to the Russians for that type of information when presumably they could obtain it from the North Koreans, who are long-standing and very close allies of theirs. But anyway, we can see how all of these stories are now circulating in the media, giving the impression that there is some great big looming threat from Iran. And I noticed that Mr. Jenrick, one of the contenders for the leadership of the Conservative Party in Britain, has just written an article in the Daily Telegraph, which appears to also lend credence to the story that there is this great developing threat and danger from Iran. As I have said in many programs, and I want to repeat and say once more, if one party wants a war, especially in a region like the Middle East, it is all but certain that that war will come. And it's clear to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu not only wants that war, but has been working to achieve it for weeks now, and he's getting closer and closer. And there are reports circulating that for the Israelis, starting this war now is becoming a priority, that in a few weeks' time, the weather conditions supposedly in the Lebanese mountains and presumably the Iranian mountains as well will become such that it'll be difficult for the drones and the aircrafts and the missiles to operate. I personally believe that the real factor in driving Prime Minister Netanyahu's timetable is the American election. In November, he must worry that whoever wins the election in November, the window of opportunity opened up by the political events in Washington, which led to the president abandoning his bid for re-election, that window of opportunity after November might start to close. So I think if we're seeing an element of urgency now appear, that much more than the weather is probably what is driving it. Anyway, there we are. This is where we are. An incredibly dangerous situation. A situation that has become more dangerous than perhaps it has been at any point since the events of October last year. The Iranians have gone bent over backwards, and I think this is not an overstatement, to avoid getting drawn into an all-out war, certainly with Israel, but even more so with the entire West. The Iranians, however, coming some months ago, around the time of, after the Haniyeh assassination, to a clear decision that a war was inevitable, the Iranians therefore turning to the Russians for help. The Russians increasingly providing that help. Witness Shoigu's repeated visits to Tehran and the announcement that was made yesterday that Russia and Iran have now agreed to a comprehensive strategic partnership with each other. Apparently Putin himself has confirmed his agreement to this, and apparently a document, an actual document, has been drafted and is only waiting for Putin's signature. So you can see that the Iranians are very busy trying to fortify themselves, build up their defenses before the storm They clearly know it's coming. And the Israelis, the Israeli government, intent on unleashing this storm. Now, just to say a few things, make a few general observations. I have been deeply critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu's policies ever since the events of October last year. I thought that the entire approach, the military campaign in Gaza, has been a political, military, and, by the way, moral disaster. There will always no doubt be arguments about how many civilians have died, but I don't think anybody disputes that thousands upon thousands have died, that there's a humanitarian crisis, that amongst the victims are women and children. I think that this is indisputably the case. We have legal cases in The Hague. There's even a claim that Israel has been lobbying Congress, members of Congress, to get them to threaten South Africa with sanctions unless South Africa drops the case it's bringing against Israel in The Hague. I don't know that these reports are true. I'd like to believe that they are not. Something tells me that they almost certainly are true. But never mind. Anyway, it's been a complete moral, legal, political, economic, and military disaster. Israel's economy is now in severe recession. Its army is overextended. Many of the hostages have been killed, and there's only been sporadic releases. The United States, or at least some people in the United States, have become exasperated. There was an article a few weeks ago in the Times of Israel saying that some officials in the US government have become so infuriated with the behavior of the two hardline Israeli ministers, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, that they'd even considered imposing personal sanctions against them. Apparently, a decision was made, nonetheless, to back off from that. But anyway, that was a report, and it appeared in the Times of Israel. I'm not saying it's necessarily true, by the way, but it was there. So the Americans, embarrassed and uncomfortable, the Americans thrown repeatedly onto the defensive in the United Nations, as I've discussed in exhaustive detail. And of course, more and more countries in the Middle East slipping away from America's orbit, joining the BRICS. And we have a BRICS summit meeting coming up in a few weeks' time in Kazan. So, Prime Minister Netanyahu's policies, in my opinion, have been a complete failure. I think they've led Israel into a cul-de-sac. I don't think that they're benefiting Israel in any conceivable way. But it's clear that he's going to double down on them. He's going to escalate the war, or at least he wants to escalate the war. He wants, as I said, to unleash the storm. And I suspect that he will unleash the storm. And of course, as we all know, he who sows the storm can reap the whirlwind. And though I say all of that with deep misgivings, I would not be surprised if that is exactly how it turns out. Anyway, there is one final point I want to make here, and that is about the event itself. Now, surprisingly enough, and I was surprised, there's been some criticism of this use of pages to assassinate people within Hezbollah in the British media. British media has been very divided on the issue of Israel. Israel, of course, continues to have some absolutely fervid supporters, like Mr. Jenrick, writing his piece in the Daily Telegraph. It's also had its stern critics as well, by the way, just saying. But On this particular attack with the pages, there's been particular criticism. And one of the aspects of this is that there's been criticism connected with how indiscriminate this attack ultimately was. Because, yes, of course, the pages were used by Hezbollah officials and fighters, but many of them were used by civilians as well. There's reports that at least one child was handling these pages and was killed, so that there is a deeply disturbing, indiscriminatory quality to this operation. It does not seem to have been a targeted killing. Whether targeted killings are themselves justified, I'm not going to explore in this programme. The Guardian, not a newspaper that I generally go to for opinion, but The Guardian has made a further point about this particular attack. And I will read the paragraph. It says, in the Second World War, this is from an editorial in The Guardian today, in the Second World War, guerrilla forces scattered large quantities of booby-trapped objects likely to be attractive to civilians. The idea was to cause wide-scale and indiscriminate death. The Japanese manufactured a tobacco pipe with a charge detonated by a spring-loaded striker. The Italians produced a headset that blew up when it was plugged in. More than half a century later, a global treaty came into force which, and then there is a quotation, prohibited in all circumstances to use booby traps or other devices in the form of apparently harmless portable objects that are specifically designed and constructed to contain explosive material, end quote. And then The Guardian goes on to say, has anyone told Israel and its jubilant supporters that, as Brian Finucane of the International Crisis Group points out, it is a signatory to the relevant protocol? Now, this is true, and by the way, I've not read this treaty. The Guardian provides a link, but it's a link to a guidance note provided by the US Department of Defense. Anyway, if what the Guardian says is true, and I strongly suspect that it is, then what Israel has done is a gross contravention of international law and perhaps a war crime. It has no military value. As I said, all of these explosive devices were detonated prematurely before the military offensive that presumably needed to be launched, and in conjunction with which these devices ought to have been exploded. Anyway, the devices were exploded before that offensive was in fact launched. So, in order to kill perhaps 20 people, injure a large number of others, but do nothing that is ultimately going to affect Hezbollah's military capability, Israel, at a time when it is already facing multiple legal challenges in The Hague, has just done something which contravenes international law, may, for all I know, be a war crime, and which might provide yet another course of legal action against it. I do wonder, I have to say this, about the sheer recklessness of Israeli decisions. I appreciate that many people have convinced themselves that Israel has total impunity over what it does. All I would say about that is that it has that impunity up to the point when it does not. And I would not assume that that impunity is going to last forever. Anyway, there we are. There's been a vast amount of discussion as to how the Israelis managed to get these devices to Hezbollah. I'm not, frankly, especially interested in talking all about that. I've had some very useful emails explaining the technical way in which it was done. I assume that the company that was doing all of this in Hungary, that put together these pages, which everybody now acknowledges was a shell company, was just a company that was acting as a cover for Israeli intelligence. Hezbollah, by the way, its intelligence was clearly at fault in sourcing these pages from that particular source. They ought to have been a great deal more careful. And as the Chinese and the Russian media have been delighted in pointing out to everybody, what this affair shows is that perhaps if you have concerns that you might not be in good standing with powerful people in the West, it might be in your interests not to access your technology from Western sources by Chinese or perhaps one day Russian instead. Anyway, lots of discussions about that. I'm not going to devote time to it. All I will say is I think that this is another massive error. I think it compounds all of the other mistakes that the Israeli government has been making ever since the events of 7th October. I think that it's going to ultimately lead to a situation where Israel's position gets even worse. But it's clear to me that we're now looking at a runaway train. I don't think that this great war in the Middle East, which others like Alistair Crook have talked about, can be avoided for very long. One very last point. I expect that next year, I've said this before, I expect that next year it will not be the war in Ukraine that is the most important story. It will be the war that we're going to see in the Middle East. Anyway, there we are. That's all I wanted to say about all of this now. Now let's turn to the situation in Ukraine, because an awful lot is happening there. The first thing I want to discuss is a long article that I have read in Ukrainska Pravda, a Ukrainian newspaper. I don't generally read this newspaper, even though it does publish in English, but I acknowledge my debt again to Jeff Roberts, the historian, who picked it up and who circulated it, and I followed the link and I read it. And the article is fascinating. It talks about infantry war at Kursk, why Ukraine's key eastern front started and continues to crumble. And it's a harrowing story. First of all, it acknowledges a basic and fundamental truth. I'm not going to read the entire article because it is very long. But the article says that the Ukrainians have been on the back foot ever since Avdiivka fell, that many of Ukraine's best troops and a lot of its equipment were destroyed in the defense of Avdiivka, that the Ukrainians, in a sense, over-invested in defending Avdiivka, that it's not been possible for them to organize a coherent defense since, that they're heavily outnumbered by the Russians, that the Russians outnumber them in men and machines and in firepower, And at one point, the article says that the Russians have a huge firepower advantage. It talks about the Russians being able to fire in this area, in the area of Pokrovsk, that they regularly carry out shelling at the rate of something like 4,500 shells a day. At least that's what I recall this article as saying. And that they drop around 100 glide bombs a day. So a massive discrepancy in firepower between the Ukrainians and the Russians. But the article also describes a further situation. It describes what looks to be chaos on the part of the High Command, that the High Command has never organized any kind of coherent defense system, that communications between military units are poor, that orders are often given that make little sense, and interestingly, that fortifications have apparently been built extensively in this area, but they are built in the wrong place. They are built sometimes in the middle of the fields where there is no cover for them, so that the Russians can shell and bomb them and conduct drone attacks against them, that the people who build the fortifications have no understanding of how fortifications should be built. And there's a reference to a Ukrainian soldier discussing the comments of of the Ukrainian MP, Mariana Bezuglaya, about the fact that she's seen all of these trenches, these empty trenches, and the soldier says, well, of course the trenches are empty, because if they're located in the middle of a field, then they are not strong defensive positions. They are death traps. And there is no sign anywhere in this article that the situation is going to get better. That on the contrary, the situation continues to get steadily worse. We hear, for example, comments like this: the Russians use guided aerial bombs more often than we use mortars. That the situation with shells on the part of the Ukrainians is getting worse. A source in the 68th Brigade says that whilst each 120mm mortar would receive 50 shells per day in March, they got far fewer in September. That's a drop in the ocean for the defense of an area like this. We need to talk about this. Our commanders need to read us the field manuals, and there are standards for combat operations. We don't meet them, and that means we can't perform tasks effectively. And we learn that the situation continues to get worse all the time, that the Ukrainians, some of them, continue to cling on to the hope that they can defend Pokrovsk itself. But, as one of them put it, the backbone of the brigades was lost during the battles near Grodivka, and the replenishments that arrived later left a lot to be desired. And this Ukrainian soldier who made that point says that in Semenyovka we had about 90% experienced people in the unit and 10% newcomers. Now we have about the same ratio, but the other way round. Anyway, there we go. That's a really dreadful report from from Ukrainska Pravda. The one thing it does say is that the claims that the Ukrainians transferred troops from the Pakrovsk area to conduct the operation in Kursk is not true. Only one battalion, apparently from Grodivka, was redeployed to the Kursk area. In all other respects, the forces that are trying to withstand Russian advances in the Pakrovsk area were left where they were, but the Russians didn't redeploy their forces either, and, well, they massively outnumber the Ukrainians. And so there we go. Now, as I said, there's a lot more in this article, and by the way, I ought to say that this article gets re-edited and changed with every reading, so just bear that in mind. But overall, the general picture is a grim one. And I'm going to make one general observation about this article. I think that man for man, you will often find that Ukraine has some very outstanding soldiers in its infantry, some very, very talented and capable and courageous small unit commanders, though their number is dwindling as a result of the attrition that the Russians are conducting. But where they are also comprehensively outmatched by the Russians, and it shows very much in this report, is at the higher command levels. No senior Ukrainian commander, not Zaluzhny, not Syrsky, not Tarnavsky, not any of the others, has the kind of thorough professional training through a succession of command schools going all the way up to the General Staff Academy that you find from the top military leadership of the Russian armed forces. No Ukrainian commander has the kind of training that Gerasimov or Mordvichev or Teplinsky or Lapin or Surovikin has, and no Ukrainian commander has the kind of insight and depth of knowledge that General Romanchuk, the Russian engineering officer who designed the Surovikin line, has. And it shows. And it's this lack of command, fully professional, joined up command at the very highest levels, that explains in large measure why the Ukrainians, all the problems, it seems to me, that many of the problems rather that Ukrainska Pravda is talking about. Now, let's turn to the situation on the battlefronts. The first thing to say is that yesterday there's an awful lot of news about the fact that there was a drone attack by the Ukrainians on an ammunition dump near the Russian city of Tver, I believe northwest of Moscow. And indeed, we had massive explosions from this ammunition dump. And apparently there was a local earthquake and all sorts of things, and there was all kinds of excited commentary about this attack on this facility, and lots of predictions and claims that it would be a major blow, especially for Group of Forces North, because supposedly Group of Forces North receives many of its supplies from this ammunition depot. Now, the ammunition depot was an important military facility. It was originally created by the Soviet Union in the 1960s, or so I understand, but it was extensively modernized and expanded around 15 years ago, with large, deep bunkers created. And my suspicion is that any really important weapons located in the area of this ammunition dump were probably located in these modernized and far stronger and more thoroughly hardened bunkers that have been built over the last 15 years. Now, there's been a lot of satellite photos of this ammunition dump. I'm not remotely competent to read these photos. All I will say is this. I've read lots of comments from many people who have looked at these photos, these satellite photos. They all say the same things, that the bunkers, the modern bunkers, look mostly undamaged. In fact, almost entirely undamaged. Any damage done was done to the Soviet facility, where most probably small arms and small arms ammunition was what was stored. And Slavyangrad, pro-Russian website, obviously, they speculated, it's only speculation, that some of the explosions that we may have seen might have come from an ammunition train close to this ammunition dump, which was being loaded with weapons, and which was caught in the open when this drone attack happened. Now, the Russians do have questions to ask themselves about this drone attack. Why was it possible for drones, Ukrainian drones? I've no doubt, by the way, that it was Ukrainian drones, not missiles. Why was it possible for Ukrainian drones to penetrate to what one would assume would be a heavily guarded facility in Western Russia? There are lots of questions of that kind. But I am going to venture my own view that given the sheer scale of Russian military production, this attack is going to cause no more than a dent. Just saying. I doubt that the effect will be visible on the front lines at all. Now let's turn instead to the situation on the battlefronts. And I'm going to begin with Pokrovsk, because the Ukrainska Pravda article was about the situation in Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians have now, DS as I understand it, has now acknowledged that Ukrainsk and the coal mine and slag heap located to the west of it are now firmly under Russian control. There are also reports today that the Russians have entered the town of Girnik to the south of Ukrainsk in earnest. If they capture Girnik, the next village south, in fact, it's almost a continuous set of buildings, is the village, or if you like, suburb of Girnik called Kurakhivka, not to be confused with the much more important town of Kurakhovo. But anyway, if these places are all captured, then obviously, and by definition, the Russians will have reached the Kurakhovo reservoir, pushing southward from the north. And of course, as we also know, they're pushing westward from Krasnogorovka as well. One way or the other, the whole situation of the Ukrainian group of forces in southern Donbass looks disastrous. And to repeat again, I think that the Ukrainians need to understand and acknowledge that fact and withdraw their forces without any further delay. Anyway, the Russians also appear to be advancing west from Ukrainsk. They're apparently attacking another coal mine and slag heap that is located some distance from Ukrainsk, just to the west of it. Apparently, if they capture that, the next target will be Tsukurinya, the village of Tsukurinya, and it is predicted that when that happens, the Ukrainian position in Selidovo will become extremely difficult because the Russians will be in a position not just to attack Selidovo, the Ukrainian positions in Selidovo from the south, but they will also be in a location from which they can start to interfere with supplies to Selidovo being sent by the Ukrainians from the west. So just saying. Now, as for Selidovo itself, the Ukrainska Pravda article confirmed that the Russians control the slag heap immediately to the north of Selidovo. And there appears to be fighting going on in Selidovo itself. Again, the details are not very clear. And over the last couple of hours, after the Ukrainians acknowledged Russian control of Ukrainsk, and some short time after, they also acknowledged Russian control of the village of Marinivka, northeast of Selidovo, and Russian control of the coal mine and slag heap on the northeast side of Grodivka. Well, they now seem to be edging towards admitting Russian control of Grodivka itself. The Russians are not only capturing all the main fortified positions that the Ukrainians have in this area, but they are steadily moving to a position where they can isolate Pokrovsk. All comparisons, again, I just have said this before, but I want to repeat this again. All comparisons between Pokrovsk and Bakhmut are wrong. If you look at a map of Pokrovsk, you see that it is basically an urban center located on a major crossroads or spider's web of roads, but there is no system of dense defense lines around it. You're talking about Bakhmut. Bakhmut formed one fortified position in a network of defense lines that included Chasov Yar, immediately to the west, Konstantinovka, not far away, other places to the north. Bakhmut was part of a major fortified line, so was Avdiivka. Avdiivka was part of a string of heavily fortified villages and cities, Krasnogorovka, Pesky, the village of Krasnogorovka, the small town of Marinka. All of these fortified positions, in effect, supported each other. If you look at a map of Pokrovsk, you can see how isolated it is. Once the Russians have cleared all this territory, have captured Kurakhovo and other places nearby, Selidovo, it will be a straightforward matter for them to conduct an operation in Pokrovsk. In fact, it will be all but impossible to continue to supply Pokrovsk, which will be relatively easy for the Russians to cut off from reinforcement and resupply. So I think expectations of a battle like Bakhmut in Pokrovsk are almost certainly wrong. Now, elsewhere, we've had further important news coming from the specific area of Toretsk. It's not always easy to get a clear picture about what is going on in Toretsk, but again, apparently Ukrainian mappers have confirmed very significant Russian advances in Toretsk. Grodivka yesterday, the Russian newspaper in Smolensk, published a long, detailed discussion about the state of the battle of Toretsk, how the Russians are now fighting in the central area of the city. I gather that, again, we are starting to see film which shows Russian soldiers in locations inside Toretsk where no one expected them to be. It could be the case that up to 20-30% of Toretsk is by now in Russian control. I myself think that, as I said, the Battle of Toretsk is coming rapidly towards an end, and I saw a Russian commentary saying that the fall of Toretsk would be as decisive in terms of developments in the Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk area as the fall of Avdiivka has been in terms of the crisis the Ukrainians are now experiencing in the area around Pokrovsk. And there's also been, and again, this is completely predictable, in my opinion, there have also been reports that the Russian soldiers have been seen again far further west in the central areas of Chasiv Yar than had previously been reported, and that the Russians are closing their two pincers from the north and south of Chasiv Yar, and that small town, major fortified position on a hill, that the situation of the Ukrainians there is becoming critical as well. Now, lastly, in this quick summary of what's going on the battlefronts, the Russians today have claimed control of Darino and Nikolaevo. Darino, two more villages close to the border in the Kursk area. It could very well be that the next objective of the Russians will be Sverdlikovo, another important village, a little to the east, and the Russians in the Kursk area, as I've said already, they seem to be closing on the village of Plekhovo, also close to the Ukrainian-Russian border. Sverdlikovo is, however, located to the west of Sudzha. Plekhovo is located to the east of Sudzha. If these two villages come under Russian control, then I think we will start to see a cauldron, the beginnings of a cauldron start to form in Kursk. The Ukrainian forces in Kursk could indeed be looking at a potential encirclement, a genuine potential encirclement. And the group of forces north are saying that the Ukrainians have basically halted their offensive in Glushkovo, that this has been a complete failure, that their various attempts to push through towards Glushkovo to capture the village of Veseloye. This is an area to the west of where the fighting in Kursk region has been taking place, that all of those attempts have been unsuccessful. And as the military summary channel has pointed out, the Ukrainians, in order to preserve the illusion that they are indeed still undertaking an offensive in the Glushkovo area, that what they're doing is that they're showing the same videos from different angles again and again, same videos that they've been showing for about a week, repeating the same film in order to create the impression of an advance that is clearly not happening. So, a grim picture for the Ukrainians, one acknowledged now by the Ukrainian media, by Ukrainska Pravda. And this, by the way, unlike, say, the Kiev Independent, is a newspaper that people in Ukraine themselves read. Now, I'm going to finish with one story that's been circulating, and that there's been some kind of back channel between the Russians and the Americans about long-range strikes that the Russians have been sending through this back channel. Very strong warnings to the US of massive Russian retaliation if missile strikes against pre-2014 Russian territory take place. I have to say this straight away. I have seen no sign, no evidence whatsoever that such a back channel between the American and Russian governments exists. And nor have I seen any evidence that such communications have been sent. But I have learnt that the Chinese media, that in China there are reports which have appeared in the media there and which have been widely discussed, including on Chinese social media, that shortly prior to Prime Minister Starmer's visit, British Prime Minister Starmer's visit to Washington, a number of former American diplomats telephoned or contacted the Russian ambassador in Washington, Mr. Antonov, and asked him to confirm with Moscow whether these warnings that President Putin was giving were meant in earnest. And that Mr. Antonov obviously confirmed that they were. Now, to be very clear, this is not a back channel, because these were open contacts, and according to the Chinese, and this is entirely based on information that comes from China, according to the Chinese, these were all ex-diplomats, though the assumption was that they were doing what they were doing on behalf of the White House, which, if true, by the way, might suggest that there were some concerns in the White House that leaving these kind of contacts to the State Department might not be particularly effective. Now, I don't know whether any of this is true. If it was, it wouldn't surprise me. I've just heard these reports. I've not read them myself. I've been told about them from somebody who speaks Chinese and who reads Chinese social media regularly. I've no doubt that these reports do exist in the Chinese media. They do appear plausible to me, but to be very clear, I don't think that you could describe these contacts as representing a back channel. It'd be entirely normal for the US government, if it were concerned about what was happening, to contact the Russian ambassador. And I'm sure that this was done in a very straightforward and open way. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say today. We are looking at, as I said, major storm clouds gathering in the Middle East. The Israeli government, in my opinion, is leading Israel into a dead end. And given that we're talking about a relatively small country, one has to have deep misgivings about where all this is going. Obviously, Israel has many friends and supporters around the world, in the United States and in Europe. But I wonder ultimately how far they will go. Just saying, I mean, I don't know. And the forces on the other side are getting bigger. The Russians are now actively involved. Where the Russians are, the Chinese often follow. I don't think that this is being properly thought through. But I don't think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is listening to whatever advice he's been given, which is telling him to slow down. In the meantime, the military situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate. President Zelensky is going to New York. He's going to bring his victory plan with him. I don't think anybody takes that especially seriously. But there we are. Anyway, that's the end of my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you all again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.